Hello, and welcome to my summary and commentary of Part 15 of the introduction to Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is a section that's really jam-packed with a lot of great quotes and a lot of great content. So it's been pretty difficult for me to try to fit it into just 2 pages of my notebook. So I'll do my best not to flip around pages here, but it might be a little bit difficult as I'll hope to quote from some of these pretty great sections. In this section, he discusses further the relation of his morphology of world history to his philosophy and to historiography, the philosophy of history generally. And he concludes the section, or in my view, the best part of his conclusion is this discussion of the classical ahistoric skepsis, as he calls it, versus the Western historic skepsis. As we reviewed earlier in this work, he views the classical soul as ahistoric, whereas the Western soul is probably the most historic of any of the high cultures. So, although skepticism, he believes, is always a symptom of the nihilistic early winter phase of a civilization, and he's just kind of introducing us at the end of this section to how it plays out differently with an ahistoric soul as compared to a historic soul. So let's jump into it now. So he begins by saying it still remains to him to find the relation between his morphology of world history and his philosophy. And he says all genuine historical work is philosophy unless it is mere ant industry. And I quite like this quote. I think, well, beyond the nice Spenglerism of kind of making fun of other people for ant industry, which would, I guess, just be the compiling and collation of historical facts, as opposed to a deeper interpretation of the facts, and in his case, a deeper interpretation according to his analogical morphological approach, comparing the high cultures. But the one thing I do wonder here, all genuine historical work is philosophy. This is, I think, is certainly true, but just can we apply this to every field? Because as I was looking through these notes again, just before starting to record, I was thinking, is this really true of every field? Because, for instance, somebody like Brett Weinstein, who I greatly admire, he often speaks about the importance of the philosophy of science to doing great science, or just doing adequate science. I mean, any scientific endeavor, if you're not considering the philosophy of science and the deep first principles questions, you're really going to be hobbled in your ability to do creative yet sound work, or creative and sound work. And this also reminded me of Stephen C. Meyer's work. I recently read Return of the God Hypothesis. I've not read his other books. As you might tell from some of my criticism of Spengler, I am quite influenced by more orthodox opinions in biology. So I'm not quite convinced with all of Stephen C. Meyer's work about Darwinism generally, and I know much less about physics, but his work with physics was very impressive to me. And in the final chapter, he speaks about some conversations he had with Thomas Nagel, who's also a great philosopher, and I think mainly focusing in philosophy of science, but I'm not quite sure Nagel's focus. I believe his most famous article is about what it would be like to be a bat, but he's also written some famous books like The View from Nowhere, and books about how the neo-Darwinian conception of the universe is almost certainly false. But Nagel himself is an atheist, which is quite funny, considering that he's shown great support for Stephen Meyer's project, whereas you have guys like Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins who just dismiss it all out of hand. But Stephen Meyer, in that final chapter, speaks about how the God of the gaps idea. So this is the idea that somebody who's a theistic scientist like Stephen Meyer well, the only leg they have to stand on is the God of the gaps. It's just the gaps in our material understanding of the universe that create any room for their conception of God. But Meyer made the great point that this assumes that there's a material cause for everything, that there are no causes outside of matter and energy, time and space, whereas probably the best ideas about cosmology and cosmogony, how the universe began, it's very difficult to posit some sort of material cause for it. And in a way, I was quite persuaded that the most parsimonious explanation is some sort of immaterial cause that precedes time and space, whether that's God or just something we call God, or maybe the Elon Musk view that we're just a simulation of some other thing. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of problems with that, because that's another one of these theories that just pushes it back. It's kind of like the panspermia theory in biology, which I believe Francis Crick even kind of endorsed, the idea that aliens came to Earth and seeded it with biological material. But then that just puts the question back of like, well, then how did the aliens evolve? Because it's very difficult to get the information-rich environment of even RNA, let alone DNA, from a random process. Almost, I don't know, if the math in Meyer's book is to be believed, and I don't have any reasonable basis to disbelieve it, other than a presumption against him, which I don't share at this point, because look, I'm doing a series on Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. I'm a very thoroughly red-pilled young man, we could say. I was the most mindless leftist drone you've ever seen up until... not that you've ever seen. I wasn't one of these crazy wokesters, but, the center-left party line, I was... kind of a true blue enforcer of that to a certain degree, to my great shame and everything. So... Anyway, so I severely red-pilled sometime in about 2020, just the whole falsity of the whole COVID-19 thing, and then the whole Antifa summer, and then the Hunter Biden story being suppressed. That really red-pilled me. And then I was fully red-pilled in late 2021. So that's when the vax mandates came to my law firm, and I was forced to take an experimental medicine just to keep my job. And then I later quit that job because my morale was shot. But the thing that really pushed me over the edge with red pilling was the Kyle Rittenhouse case, man. Just seeing, well, when Sheriff Feces just grilling that little punk Gage Grosskreutz, and I just saw a clip of it, and, he just shows that Grosskreutz is a total liar, and that he was actually pointing a gun at Rittenhouse when Rittenhouse finally fired on him. And Rittenhouse is on the ground at that point. He's just been hit by a skateboard and everything. He's been running for his life. And anyway, it was just so easy to see that this kid was totally innocent and totally within his rights for self-defense. But people just will not listen to it. That gets back to Thomas Sowell's idea about the vision of the anointed, that once the anointed, quote-unquote, the anointed, the left, once they reach an opinion, that is the opinion, and it cannot change. So the Rittenhouse case, they had their narrative within 12 hours that, a racist right-winger fires on all these peaceful protesters who are just, just amazing Americans. And no evidence at the trial could change that. So just witnessing that Rittenhouse trial in late 2021, that was like the final red pill for me, where I was like, I will not believe anything that these fucking people say ever again. So to tie that back in with Stephen Meyer, that's why I'm very amenable to his ideas about theistic science, because, clearly somebody like Lawrence Krauss or Richard Dawkins, I just fundamentally don't trust people who are celebrated in the mainstream media. I don't trust them whatsoever. So I don't have any presumption against Stephen Meyer's ideas. And if he's going to present evidence that seems plausible, that that even if you take this whole chemical evolution RNA world hypothesis, that you would need like the lifetime of like 100 universes or more just for that to happen, just for the first kind of protein fold, or the first the most limited bit of morphological biological information to develop randomly would take. It's crazy because you're seeing all these numbers in scientific notation, like 10 to the 100th and 10 to the 150th or something, which are just numbers that it's hard for the human mind to even contemplate. But I'm sorry for this long tangent. I hope it's been interesting. So maybe I'm a liar about trying to be succinct with this video, but it just ties back in that God of the gaps. The God of the gaps hypothesis, or the God of the gaps conclusion, really, because somebody like Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss is not going to be stating this as if it were a hypothesis, but it already presupposes that there's a material cause for everything. So it's basically a circular argument. And this just gets back into Weinstein's point, Brett Weinstein's point, who I like Brett infinitely more than I like Eric Weinstein. Eric Weinstein is absolutely insufferable. And you can come back with counter arguments to me on that. I'm wholly open to that. But my experience is that Eric Weinstein is completely blue-pilled and completely insufferable. And I just don't even know what his angle is anymore. I just don't even want to hear anything he's got to say. So just to tie it back with Spengler, who says all genuine historical work is philosophy unless it is mere ant industry. Well, I would say all genuine scientific work of any kind is also philosophy at a very fundamental level, because if you're not examining your first principles, if you're like Krauss and Dawkins out there and you just assume there's a material cause for everything, which I mean, not an unreasonable assumption in a lot of ways, but it is going to get circular when you go and you say it's all God of the gaps, because then that presupposes that there's a material cause for everything, and that anything that anyone would attribute to God is necessarily just an incomplete understanding of the material universe. So I'm sorry to belabor that point. Let's move on. Now Spengler says systematic philosophers overlook the fact that every thought lives in a historical world and is therefore involved in the common destiny of mortality. So this is another great point, and it does somewhat illustrate Spengler's kind of doctrinaire historicism. So historicism, which is a word I was actually just recently acquainted with from Alan Bloom's, from Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind, which I'm about 60% of the way through. It's really a very interesting book. I hope to do a summary and commentary on Bloom's work. It's really, I think, a cri de coeur, from someone who really loved the American universities and is very, very sad about everything that's happened to them. But this was written in 1987, and everything's gotten exponentially worse in the 35-ish years since then. So I really hope to investigate that more. But he speaks about historicism, which is a very good word for describing Spengler. Interestingly, there are so many points in The Closing of the American Mind where Bloom could mention Spengler. I mean, he goes on at length about guys like Nietzsche and Max Weber, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism is his most famous work, but he was very, very important in kind of the Nietzscheanization of the left, or the leftization of Nietzsche, as you could say. This kind of, well, and the same thing happened with Heidegger. And basically through the French postmodernists, you get these deep influences on the Nazis. Nietzsche, who was an influence, who was much deeper thinking than the Nazis and would have been appalled by all that. But then Heidegger, the literal card-carrying Nazi. And then you have these French postmodernist knuckleheads who kind of deconstruct and then reconstruct these guys as icons of the left. It's all very laughable. But there's so many moments there where Bloom he could mention Spengler, but he never does. And Bloom's learning is very, very sound, very broad, very deep, as far as I can understand things. So maybe while he was just reading all these other works, which he cites very interestingly, maybe he just didn't have time to try to engage with Oswald Spengler's 1,000 plus pages about history. But it does seem like the work could just be that little bit richer if he did mention Spengler a little bit. But anyway, so I was refreshed about this word historicism. So this is a term that is very apt for Oswald Spengler. He's a true historicist. He believes that everything is only valid for that historical moment. The ideas, the men, if a man isn't attuned to his historical moment, he will be of no importance whatsoever. And that's what he's getting at here, with the fact that every thought lives in a historical world and is therefore involved in the common destiny of mortality. So I've gone on about the Lindy effect in some prior episodes and how I think that, yes, ideas I do also believe are mortal, and this also would tie in with Richard Dawkins's mimetic theory, which I believe Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying have done some interesting stuff. They view it as more of an epigenetic phenomenon, but who knows? Whereas Dawkins would view mimetic evolution as entirely separate from biological evolution. Weinstein and Heying view it as epigenetic in the sense that ideas are only going to propagate to the extent that they help the adherent to the idea, the one acting out the ideas. So I think that's all could be a very rich vein for somebody who's interested in Spengler, to really look at his ideas through a more mimetic, epigenetic lens, as the case may be, but certainly a lens that's more informed by Anglophone Darwinism, we could say. The work just suffers from being kind of myopically German. So, I mean, I don't want to overemphasize interdisciplinarity, because interdisciplinarity is often a refuge for the bullshit artist in the modern day. Just like so many things, the woke have just given interdisciplinarity a bad rap to a certain extent. Anyway, anyway. So common destiny of mortality for ideas, that's certainly true, but as incorporeal objects that aren't subject to traditional physical biological limits, how much can we view their mortality as similar to a human being's mortality? That's always going to be a big question in my mind whenever I bring up these sorts of passages. So anyway, on to the next point. He says, the systematic philosopher supposes that higher thought possesses an everlasting and unalterable objectiveness, that the great questions of all epochs are identical, and that therefore they are capable in the last analysis of unique answers. So here I have in my notes, does Spengler conflate different questions in a headlong rush to criticize systematic philosophers? And the two questions I'm worried about him conflating here are, the first one is an everlasting and unalterable objectiveness for higher thought process. Yeah, for higher thought. And then the second one, the great questions of all epochs are identical. I think he's certainly right with respect to the second one. The great questions of all epochs are certainly not identical, and any systematic philosophy, particularly a systematic philosophy of history, that doesn't take that into account is going to be very weak. And that's where I think Spengler's made a huge contribution here. But his idea that higher thought can never possess an everlasting and unalterable objectiveness, I revolt against that. There are higher thoughts that are everlasting and unalterable. In fact, he does also recognize this with his world as nature versus world as history distinction. But I guess, being charitable to him, we can say, well, he's only looking at world as history ideas. So maybe you could say that. Now, fundamentally, I disagree with this dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy, world as nature versus world as history, particularly when he puts all biological phenomena within world as history rather than world as nature. So yeah, that's just always going to be a big question for me, and sometimes I think he kind of, just conflates questions or kind of skates around things when he's just really got kind of this headlong rush towards a predetermined conclusion. So he continues, but question and answer are here one, and the great questions are made great by the very fact that unequivocal answers to them are so passionately demanded, so that it is as life symbols only that they possess significance. And this, I think, is a very interesting point. Now, in the first part of the sentence, we kind of get what I consider an excess of Spenglerian rhetoric, where he says, question and answer here are one. Well, it doesn't sound like you're subjecting your question to a sufficient amount of scrutiny if question and answer are one. Any question that answers itself in your view, that's advocacy. That's not science. So that I take some exception with. But I think he's also got a good point here, that the great questions are made great by the fact that people are asking about them, the fact that people are passionately asking about them. So this kind of shows his practical bent. I have a friend who loves kind of analytic philosophy, and this is the type of guy who's absorbed with such fascinating questions as whether motion actually exists, which for a guy like me, nothing could be more of a waste of time, because everybody's phenomenological experience tells them that something as simple as motion clearly exists, and I don't think we're all fooling ourselves. And this would be something like Ian McGilchrist, who's somebody I really want this friend to read, would say is kind of the left brain tuning out the right brain. Because there is some theoretical system that you could get deep enough into in this kind of left brain systematizing without checking the results against the real world. That McGilchrist thinks is a real hallmark of how the left brain attends to the world. And that's kind of what my friend likes. And these are really where you can criticize systematic philosophers pretty intensely, because it's just fucking idiotic. Like, you think motion doesn't exist. Wow, wow, so interesting. And then my friend, after he's had 3 or 4 beers, will just yell at me. He's like, that's just because of your undying commitment to pragmatism. I was like, yeah, I guess. I mean, I guess it's my undying commitment to phenomenological reality. And that's where kind of the right brain comes in. And this is where Ian McGilchrist would say a Heraclitean, Heraclitus, the great pre-Socratic philosopher. He had a great quote. I forget exactly how it goes, but it's basically and it's a shame because only his fragments are left to us. He wrote much more that we don't have. And this will tie into a point from Spengler a little bit later, because Spengler often emphasizes the incompleteness of the evidence that we have from the classical world, which you would predict under his theory because he views the classical as an ahistoric soul that didn't seek to preserve documents in the way that the Western would, or the Egyptian, or the Chinese, which he views as the most highly historical of the high cultures. But so McGilchrist would say, so the Heraclitus quote, sorry, is something like, if you see something that you already understand, you see nothing at all. And that's, again, a paraphrase, but so the right brain is, the way it attends to the world is more kind of this open-ended attention that's not going to get caught up in kind of this kind of armchair theorizing. And it's only through that kind of systematic armchair theorizing that such a preposterous notion as the idea that motion does not exist could find any sort of credence, any sort of currency. So yeah, I mean that's where I think Spengler's very strong in criticizing the systematic philosophers, to the extent he criticizes them in a way that Ian McGilchrist would. I pretty much support what he's doing. But tying this back in with this sentence, that's why he's viewing this as so important, that unequivocal answers are so passionately demanded. It shows that this is important to the people. It has life. It has an organic life force, because you're at that time in the historical period, in the cyclical organismic theory of each high culture as a life form. You're in that time of its life cycle where these questions become important as a theoretical matter, as a pragmatic matter, whatever it may be. And obviously Spengler thinks we lean more and more towards the pragmatic as civilization sets in. And Spengler also views the theoretical, theoretical as theoretical, as weak and inorganic. He would view the strong or the questions having organic life force and demanding these passionate answers. Those are religious questions, and those are the eternal questions. But both Spengler and Gustave Le Bon would view the religious ideas that try to answer those questions as losing their strength over the course of a culture, as losing their organic necessity, as these pragmatic or nihilistic concerns grow in the civilization phase. He says there are no eternal truths. Every philosophy is the expression of its own and only its own time. And he says, if by philosophy we mean effective philosophy and not academic triflings about judgment forms, sense categories, and the like, no two ages possess the same philosophic intentions. The difference is not between perishable and imperishable doctrines, but between doctrines which live their day and doctrines which never live at all. So, basically he's saying that, like, Kantian philosophy, this systematic philosophy of judgment forms, sense categories, the stuff that my buddy would really like, the analytic philosopher who doesn't think motion exists, or even thinks it's a question. Because to even think that motion doesn't exist is a question of any value is something that I revolt against. I mean, maybe if you're René Descartes, you might think that that's a very brilliant question. I don't know. I'm not a solipsist, and I'm not an idiot. So, like, it's a question of the most trifling importance to me. But his next sentence here is very interesting. The immortality of thoughts become is an illusion. The immortality of thoughts become is an illusion. Now, I'm not sure if I can join him quite there, because as much as I think a lot of this analytic, systematic philosophy is just a bunch of masturbatory bullshit, there's just certain ideas that just are, thoughts become, and are immortal. 2 plus 2 equals 4, okay? And you might say it in a foreign language. You can say it with different words. You can say, 二加二等于四. 2 plus 2 equals 4, okay? But it's true. It's true always and everywhere. And anybody who can't subscribe to that statement is a doctrinaire relativist and a postmodernist likely and a bullshit artist almost certainly. And what about pi? What about pi? The relationship of a radius to a circle's circumference and to its area is always going to be pi. This is going to be a fundamental constant that's always going to exist. What about e? Right, which is very important for natural logarithms and for other work. And there's so many of these transcendental numbers that are of just immense importance, and there's no way to say that just because their thoughts become, and again, this gets back to the deep German idealistic, in the sense of German idealism, the philosophical school, the deep German idealistic roots of Oswald Spengler's thinking, because he has to, in his philosophy, make this big distinction between things becoming and things become. And it'll be interesting when he criticizes Schopenhauer later in this section for retaining Kantian terminology, because Spengler retains a lot of Kantian and other German idealistic terminology that is it really of any analytical use, or is it just terminological baggage, theoretical baggage that decreases the parsimony of Spengler's thought? We've got to ask ourselves that. So I completely disagree with him here on the immortality of thoughts become is an illusion. No. The day when every human is dead, when there's nothing left, even if there's no aliens, there's no nothing, there's no creature within the universe to think that 2 plus 2 equals 4, 2 plus 2 still equals 4. There's no creature to draw a circle and recognize that the relationship of the diameter to the circumference is pi. No, that it still exists. 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 Shut up, Oswald. Shut the fuck up. That's fucking stupid. It still exists. And again, maybe this gets back to kind of the naive materialism of this day, because you look at somebody like Thomas Nagel, Ian McGilchrist, others like this, who view consciousness as perhaps being ontologically prior to the material world. They would never say something so foolish. And again, Spengler's caught up with theoretical baggage here with this thing become versus thing becoming, which it's interesting. It's kind of an interesting dichotomy. But again, it's just these German philosophers with that sponge just trying to wring out every last drop from these dichotomies that they are so enamored with. He says, the greater the man, the truer the philosophy. So, again, some more German rhetoric for our viewing pleasure. On to the next point. The test of a thinker's value is his eye for the great facts of his own time. There are clever architects of systems on one hand, who Spengler doesn't respect at all, and on the other hand, there is the one who intuits the very soul of his time. So this is Spengler. Spengler is the one who intuits the very soul of his time. I don't know. You tell me. I think there's truth to it. He's had predictive power, and, is he just scattershotting his predictions? Because some turn out to be true, some turn out to maybe not be so true, or they haven't had enough time to prove themselves to be true yet. So are you saying, well, he just made all these predictions and that's why some come out right? Well, maybe, but the fact that he's predicted things that ring so true to our ears in 2023 means that we cannot dismiss Spengler out of hand, even with all his mysticism, even with all his German idealism. And believe me, there's nothing I want to dismiss out of hand more than a German idealist. But, hey, the fact is, this guy's made some interesting predictions, and we need to deal with his thought. So I do think that on at least some level, he does intuit the very soul of his time. So I don't think him basically complimenting himself here is much of a sin in any way. You know, and this is a tangent for sure, but small people, petty people, are the ones that criticize a great thinker for being arrogant. And the arrogance, the confidence level of any thinker, very unimportant. How politely he speaks to you, how well he makes you feel about yourself, how good he makes you feel about yourself, to speak a little bit more precisely and less solecistically. That's so unimportant. And you're a complete jackass if you think that any great thinker needs to speak to you in the way that you deem commensurate with your level of dignity as a listener. Like, I mean, yeah, sure, that's why a lot of philosophers aren't the most popular guys in the world. But that is a matter of the most trifling importance. And more people need to get up and say things like that. More people need to say, you know what, I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck what you think, because you haven't read enough books. You're not there working to actually understand the world. And your feelings about my philosophy, about Oswald Spengler's philosophy, are so unimportant. Your feelings about how Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks to you, oh, I think Nassim Nicholas Taleb sounds arrogant. You can't hold a candle to him. I mean, Nassim Nicholas Taleb blocked me on Twitter. I don't think his conduct on Twitter is necessarily commensurate with his dignity. He should comport himself with greater dignity because of the greatness of his thoughts, and maybe even a little pipsqueak like me should as well. But if you're there and you're not reading Nassim Nicholas Taleb's books because, oh my god, he's so arrogant, why does he say that about the economists and the philosophers? Why Nassim Nicholas Taleb so mean to the good economists, man? I mean, like, you're just a total little D-bag. Like, you need to shut up and just read what he's got to say. Like, it's not like this guy's the fucking Marquis de Sade or something. I mean, like, he's not like an evil person. Like, he's but you have small and petty people who would say, well, Oswald Spengler's a little bit arrogant sometimes, so I don't read him. Nassim Nicholas Taleb is unpleasant, so I don't read him. Nah, you ain't shit. Read better minds than yourselves, because you ain't shit. All right? So, on to the next point. He says, the ability to grasp and command actuality. This is really the test of a true philosopher. And now he compares what he views as kind of the unworldly and deed-shy philosophers who appear later in the civilization phase or towards the end of the culture. So think fall and winter in our seasonal metaphor. So he says here, you know, a philosopher who cannot grasp and command actuality as well will never be of the first rank. The pre-Socratics, so guys like Heraclitus, were merchants and politicians en grand. The desire to put his political ideas into practice in Syracuse, Sicily, nearly cost Plato his life. So, again, and this would be like a Talebian point about just kind of what a stooge Plato was on a lot of levels. Now, an interesting prose stylist. I like his dialogues in a lot of ways. I wish I had, engaged with them earlier, and I need to engage with them more because they're so influential in the history of Western and global thought. But again, Plato's a stooge. Like, if you take him at his word, and I kind of subscribe to the Alan Bloom perspective, that there are parts, particularly, I believe, the end of Book 3 or Book 4 of The Republic, where I just cannot believe that this is not Socratic irony, and the fact that people take what Socrates, as Plato's character here, or maybe Socrates himself, who knows, take what he's saying here at face value is really more indicative of their naivete than anything else. But so he says, and it was the same Plato who discovered the set of geometrical theorems that enabled Euclid to build up the classical system of mathematics. Pascal, whom Nietzsche knew only as the broken Christian. What a nice way to say that. Descartes, Leibniz were the first mathematicians and technicians of their time. So that's kind of interesting. I guess actually, as I read this again, is Spengler's more casting an aspersion at Nietzsche here, because he's viewing Pascal, Descartes, and Leibniz in favorable terms. Anytime Spengler's going to put you in a sentence with Gottfried Leibniz, that's going to be a very big compliment. Spengler views Gottfried Leibniz very, very highly. Very, very highly. So he's actually, he's viewing Pascal here much more favorably than Nietzsche. So that's interesting. That's very interesting. Because I would think, in a lot of respects, he wouldn't like Pascal, but he's kind of making fun of Nietzsche for knowing him only as the broken Christian. And I really need to read more of Pascal's pensée, his thoughts. That's a book I really need to get. So you know, I mean, I'm just one guy here with an incomplete understanding of the history of Western philosophy, of everything else, but I'm here trying to give you my best effort in the most sincere way I can. And so he also talks a little bit about these pre-Socratics of China. I don't think that's going to be very interesting for you guys, so I'm going to skip that. And so from here, he says, there's no modern philosophers who are engaged in any big actuality, any big real project that has practical importance. Excuse me. And he contrasts them with a number of earlier philosophers, because he's going to view the early philosophers in any culture as the ones who are of much greater value, because they're the ones who actually have life symbols for ideas, actually have ideas that have organic strength to them. And so here on page 56, he discusses first Pythagoras, who he calls kind of a Cromwellian Pythagoras. So, and there's actually a chapter in volume 2 called Pythagoras, Cromwell, and Muhammad, or Muhammad. I forget the order that they put it, but it's those three. So he views them in his special way as contemporaneous. Each one appears in their respective culture at that same time in its life cycle. So Pythagoras for the classical, Cromwell for the Western, and Muhammad for the Arabian, in Spengler's view, all appear at a contemporaneous period in the life cycles of those cultures. So that's the final chapter. He has these kind of 3-chapter series in volume 2, and that's the final chapter in Problems of the Arabian Culture. Cromwell, Pythagoras, and Muhammad, or whatever it is, whatever order he puts them in. And actually, we'll get to that when I do my review of Volume 2 for us here. But I thought that was the weakest of his Arabian culture chapters, to be honest. I thought those first 2 chapters in the Problems of the Arabian Culture, those might have been my 2 favorite chapters from Volume 2. But then I felt like that final chapter of that section was a bit of a letdown. But who knows? I mean, I hope we can discuss it well, and I'll hear some interesting thoughts from all of you about it. So he says Pythagoras was the organizer of an important political movement akin to the Cromwellian, so akin to a kind of puritanical movement. And he says the significance of which is even now far underestimated by classical researchers. So this gets back to that point from earlier about Heraclitus's fragments are the only things that's left to us of him, even though he wrote much more extensively. And so much of the evidence of the real blossoming of classical culture or of Chinese culture or of Indian culture is lost to us. So it's very interesting, and I think any good historiography has to account for these kind of epistemological lacunae, we could say, or evidentiary lacunae. The evidence that's lacking has got to be important to our epistemology, to our understanding of how we can even study history. And for a guy like me who loves the Proto-Indo-Europeans, I mean, fascinated by him, David W. Anthony, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, just go and buy it, okay? Great book. He uses historical linguistics and archaeology together as kind of a synergistic, greater than the sum of their parts here, to corroborate each other, to try to find out where the Proto-Indo-European homeland was and when each branch of the Proto-Indo-European family broke off, and where. It's a fascinating book, but something like that, when you're getting into prehistoric history, that's going to really test your historiography, really test the epistemological limits of your history, and it's the most interesting history you can do. So, Spengler, to a large degree, really understands that, and really understands that so much of the evidence has been lost from the classical. Now, on the flip side of that, does that lead to self-indulgence? Because anytime you're arguing from evidence that isn't there, I mean, there's a real danger that you can just be projecting whatever you want that evidence to be onto the non-existent evidence. That would be kind of the same, what do I want to say, intuition that's underlying kind of those God of the Gaps arguments that I was talking about a little bit earlier with guys like Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins. I mean, certainly it is difficult to argue from a lack of evidence. And anyway, so Spengler thinks Pythagoras is very important, but a lot of evidence has been lost about him. And he thinks Pythagoras was like a Cromwell, maybe like a John Calvin or a Martin Luther to some degree. But if he's saying Cromwellian rather than Luther or Calvin, maybe he views Pythagoras as having some more military exploits. I'm not quite sure. And now, as always, we have to get an obligatory compliment for Goethe. So he says, Goethe, a model executive minister. He was also interested in the Suez and Panama canals. And this is true. I mean, Goethe saw very early, by the late 18th century, Goethe already sees clearly that cutting a canal in Suez, the Sinai Peninsula, basically. So this connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, allows you to have maritime traffic between Europe and Asia without needing to go around Africa, So it cuts the distance greatly. So there's three great maritime choke points in the world, in my view. And you could define these differently, but there's two are man-made. So that's the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal, to an American, obviously, it's even more important than the Suez Canal because, well, especially before we had the railroad. Well, it came around after we had the railroads, but Goethe is speculating about it before we had transcontinental railroads. So that would be enormously helpful for going from the West Coast to the East Coast before you had railroads or airlines, obviously. Because now you don't need to go around some of the worst water in the world. You don't want to be around the Cape of, Cape Horn, is it? Down there south of Patagonia. the tip of South America, I mean, many men have lost their lives on the Southern Ocean. Even the Cape of Good Hope around South Africa is pretty bad. But Cape Horn is another matter entirely. No sailor wants to be on those seas. Terrible, terrible seas. Interesting, this guy Douglas Crowhurst. Look up his story if you like interesting mystery stories and kind of tales of madness. But he didn't make it down there. I mean, he kind of falsified some logs. Anyway, look him up, Douglas Crowhurst. Very interesting story. But so the great choke points are the Suez, the Panama Canal. So these are just incredibly strategically important. And then there's one more, and this one is natural. It's not man-made. The Straits of Malacca. This is part of why Singapore is such a prosperous city. Singapore sits on the Straits of Malacca. And this was the most important, because if you can't go through the Straits of Malacca, you've got to go around the entire Indonesian archipelago if you want to go between China and India on the ocean. Okay? Enormously important strategic choke point. So the Portuguese and then the British and then now Singapore and obviously the United States really controls the traffic. The United States is not going to let anybody else truly control any maritime traffic, and we never should. The existence of the Blue Water Navy, that's the real strength of any great nation. So anyway, those are the three great strategic maritime choke points in the world. Strait of Hormuz, much less so, because that's between what is it, Yemen maybe, but it's between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. You know, a small strait. It has outsized importance today because petroleum is still the most important commodity in the world, and the best and cheapest to produce oil fields in the world still exist in the Persian Gulf. So Tehran, and then, you know, many others, where they send people from Texas who are good at petroleum engineering to help them get their oil out of there. I mean, dude, come on. It's all Saudi Aramco and these guys. Couldn't do it without American expertise. A few things can be done without. Well, I mean, 40 years of neo-Marxist infiltration, subversion, and demoralization. Are there going to be any great American engineers in the years to come? I hope so. Anyway, so that's good. And he is not only a great philosopher, but also a bit of a man of fact here. Not that all of his kind of practical, pragmatic endeavors went that well, but that's another matter. At least he had this vision here. He can see 100 years before these canals are created how valuable the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal will become. And then the third one is Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes. So he's known for the work Leviathan primarily, and he wrote some other works. To be honest, I haven't read the primary sources there. He's a very, very influential English philosopher, and he was the originator of the Great Plan. I mean, ostensibly, I haven't verified this, but let's trust Spengler here. The originator of the Great Plan of winning South America for England, and although in the execution of the plan, it went no further than the occupation of Jamaica, he has the glory of being one of the founders of the British colonial empire. So again, Spengler showing his respect for men of fact and the things that they do. And then finally, Gottfried Leibniz, who is, without, in Spengler's view here, without doubt the greatest intellect in Western philosophy, the founder of the differential calculus and the analysis situs, which is now known as topology, the editor tells us. And he conceived or cooperated in a number of major political schemes, And the one that Spengler really likes is he tries to relieve Germany by drawing the attention of Louis XIV, the greatest of the Bourbon kings, to the importance of Egypt as a factor in French world policy. And he does this already by 1672. Leibniz tries to let Louis XIV know, hey, Egypt, hey, don't fight in Germany. This is, these little gains you can get in the Rhineland and everything. Come on, that's nothing. You could really improve France's position by getting a toehold in Egypt. And sure enough, a little bit more than 100 years later, that's exactly what Napoleon tries to do. Very interesting campaigns. Obviously, tremendous scholarly advancements come from those French campaigns in Egypt. Most emblematic of which is the Rosetta Stone, and it's the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone, which now allows us to understand Egyptian hieroglyphics. One of the all-time great accomplishments in the history of philology and linguistics. So those are true men of fact, but also philosophers, people that Spengler would rank so much higher than any systematic philosopher. So yeah. And he says, the modern philosophers, their lack of practical acumen, this indicates not that they possess inwardness, but simply that they lack weight. And, basically none of them have any far-reaching opinions, and it's all provincial opinions. I was going to talk a little bit more about that, but I've talked about some other things. So, on to the next point. He says, the sense of actualities is an infallible symptom of a philosophy's inward necessity, fruitfulness, and symbolic importance. This sense of actualities is, of course, not the same thing as the content of a philosophy, but I repeat, it is an infallible symptom of a philosophy's inward necessity, its fruitfulness, and its symbolic importance. So, maybe we can say that Spengler's philosophy gets all of these, because he certainly had some fruitfulness in terms of his predictive accuracy, or his sense of actualities is actually what should properly be emphasized there. His sense of actualities, leads to the predictive accuracy. And since he has some predictive accuracy, is this an infallible symptom, an infallible sign? Because symptom has a negative connotation. An infallible sign of the inward necessity, fruitfulness, and symbolic importance of his philosophy. Maybe. Certainly kind of some grand rhetoric here that a modern-day English speaker is going to be a little bit wary of. But now he says, these modern philosophers, it's palpable that they have lost sight of the final significance of effective philosophy. They've lost sight of the final aims, the ends of philosophy. He says, we confuse philosophy with preaching, with agitation, with novel writing, with lecture-room jargon. Kimberly Crenshaw on line 1, Judith Butler on line 2. Come on, how poignant is this? How poignant is this right here? We confuse philosophy with preaching, with agitation, with novel writing, with lecture-room jargon. All the critical race theorists, all the postmodernists, the reified postmodernisms, gender studies, just all the nonsense in the modern academy. Here it is in one sentence. Confusing philosophy with preaching, agitation, novel writing, and lecture-room jargon. Poignant, prescient, brilliant. And he says, it would be far better to become a colonist or an engineer than to be this kind of a philosopher, particularly in this day and age where you're in the early winter, as he calls it, where you're in this civilization phase. It's better to be a man of action, someone who's actually engaging in techniques. So he says, if not, it were far better to become a colonist or an engineer, to do something, no matter what, that is true and real, to do something no matter what that is true and real, than to chew over once more the old dried up themes under cover of an alleged new wave of philosophic thought. Far better to construct an aero engine than a new theory of apperception that is not wanted. Truly, it is a poor life's work to restate once more, in slightly different terms, views of 100 predecessors on the will or on psychophysical parallelism. This may be a profession, but a philosophy it emphatically is not. A doctrine that does not attack and affect the life of the period in its inmost depths is no doctrine, and had better not be taught. And what was possible even yesterday is today at least not indispensable. And now he says, to me, the depths and refinement of mathematical and physical theories are a joy. By comparison, the aesthete and the physiologist are fumblers. So again, he speaks to us about his view, and in the next chapter, we're really going to see how deep his mathematical knowledge is when he compares the classical and the Western number feeling. Again, kind of a German monstrosity translated into English. But so here, my question is, but aren't at least some of these thoughts become these mathematical and physical theories? So he views each mathematics, each physics, as only being for that high culture. There's only a Western math and a classical math, a Chinese physics and an Indian physics. And this is kind of scary when you think about what the modern postmodernists have done, like a guy who we're all in his debt, James Lindsay, the very courageous and knowledgeable James Lindsay. He one of his recent punching bags is feminist glaciology. Feminist glaciology, or glaciology, I think sounds a bit better. But feminist glaciology. So this is what they try to do. They try to just make this crap up. And somebody like Spengler, if you're not reading him correctly, if you're reading him in a self-serving, motivated manner, he could be a stepping stone on the way to feminist glaciology. He could certainly be a stepping stone because he doesn't view mathematics or physics even, or chemistry, as being eternal fields. He views each one in this very doctrinaire historicist, doctrinaire relativist way as being solely the product of that high culture and not having any eternal truth validity. So I disagree with him here, and I think a lot of mathematical, physical, chemical, biological thought is, quote unquote, a thought become. I wouldn't adopt that dichotomy because I don't think it's useful for analysis, but anyway. So he says, I prefer one Roman aqueduct to all Roman temples and statues. Again, this is emphasizing the focus on technics in the civilized phase, because the Romans were past the time of temples and statues. That wasn't what was good for them, because they were too late in the life cycle. What they were good for are these pragmatic engineering feats, the aqueducts. And that's what we should be good for as well, in his view. And now he compares the Imperial Fora, modern international exhibitions, and Rameses II's grandiose constructions at Luxor and Karnak. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. Now, the one interesting thing is that the World's Fair, and things like that have are basically totally decrepit now, or what do I want to say, defunct. They're totally defunct. I mean, the last great World's Fair, there was one in Shanghai in 2010. I actually was there because I was studying in China at that time. It was between semesters. So I went, and it was interesting. Well, and it would be in China, because China, especially at that time, a lot of life force, you could say, because Western thoughts were just getting in there. Western techniques were just getting in there. Relatively, they, about 30 years. So So yeah, that was the first one since like the 1960s that had been a big deal for anybody, and that when the World's Fair was really in its heyday was like back in like the 1890s, the early 1900s. I mean, and further back into like, I think there were some good ones like the 1850s, 1860s. I believe the Crystal Palace in London, for any Premier League fans, was created for a World's Fair and things like that. And even the name of Chicago is the Windy City, because windy at that time meant boastful. Was, I think, Chicago and St. Louis were fighting for the World's Fair. Maybe it was New York and Chicago. I forget, but somebody from the city that was competing with Chicago said, "Hey, don't listen to those windy guys from that windy city." And it's funny. I mean, because people just think, I mean, obviously Chicago's on the shore of Lake Michigan, so I'm sure it gets some very chilly winds. But anyway, so it's just interesting here because he's comparing these, and this is all very plausible, all these grandiose constructions at the civilized phase. But these modern international exhibitions have actually lost a lot of force in our age. Now, maybe is that just an effect of greater mass communications culminating in the internet, where people don't need to gather at one place to admire the latest and greatest in science? Or is it a symptom of this even more profound lassitude in the civilized phase here? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just a symbol of the increasing lassitude and this increasing focus on bread and circus, because the only truly kind of great constructions you see in a place like America or even England and Europe are the newest football stadiums, whatever people call football in the one country or the other. I mean, aren't these the greatest architectural achievements in our day and age? I mean, the new football stadium, wherever it may be, like this new SoFi in Los Angeles a few years ago, beautiful stadium. And they are nice. I mean, geez, they are nice. I'm not trying to take anything away from them. But it's certainly indicative of the great focus on bread and circus in our day. So there's something to that. The new Yankee Stadium from about 15 years ago, and that's not even close to the nicest stadium in baseball these days. So there's a lot to that. And we don't even have international exhibitions largely anymore. We just have sporting exhibitions. The Bird's Nest in Beijing for 2008. And, whatever they built in Rio de Janeiro and is Tokyo the last one? And wait, is it coming back to America in 2024? Is it going to Los Angeles? Maybe they'll have something at SoFi Stadium. I forget. We've certainly got the World Cup coming in 2026. I think that should be a good one. We'll see. But anyway, it's just interesting. So maybe we're even further along because we don't even have international exhibitions anymore. It's just stadiums. And he says, the instinct for the realities of life tells civilized man that art and philosophy are exhausted. I think there's some truth to that. I won't belabor that point. He says, today, many an inventor, a diplomat, or a financier is a sounder philosopher than any experimental psychologist. This is brilliant. This brings me back to my days at SUNY Binghamton, State University of New York at Binghamton, studying psychology, and how much I regret studying psychology instead of something weightier. I mean, psychology is just such a bunch of bullshit. Like, it really is. Modern academic psychology. And you look at all these counselors today, it's just sad. I mean, just meat for the medical industrial complex at this point. I mean, I'd love to talk to, it's good to talk to your friends about your problems in life. If you can talk to a priest, if you can talk to somebody with some wisdom about life, about life's problems, like, certainly do. But I've seen what counseling did to my brother, who's now a fucking woman or whatever, and completely miserable, and he's like 35 and he fucking cuts himself like a teenage girl. Like, it's really fucking sad. And it's all these professional, quote unquote, professional psychologists, basically egging people on to jump off a fucking building at this point, metaphorically or not. I don't even know. They probably, if you think that, your suffering would end, I just want to, affirm you. Clowns. Anyway, and then you could also tie that back in with guys like Nassim Nicholas Taleb, whether you like him or hate him. The guy's a deep philosopher and obviously a financier at heart. I mean, financier might be a little grandiose. He's a trader at heart. He's not a... George Soros is a financier. Nassim Nicholas Taleb is a trader. That's my view, but... And I mean, Nassim Nicholas Taleb's philosophy is so much sounder than any psychologist in America. So this rings so true. And it's sentences like this that are why people keep coming back to Oswald Spengler. On to the next point. I want to quote this entirely, because this is a pretty good one. Oh, jeez, where's this quote? Okay. A century of purely extensive effectiveness, excluding big artistic and metaphysical production, let us say frankly, an irreligious time which coincides exactly with the idea of the world city, is a time of decline. I love this. An irreligious time which coincides exactly with the idea of the world city is a time of decline. A very, very important idea in Spenglerian thought. Of central importance. The religious time is when you have artistic and philosophical growth, when the prime symbol of the culture is actually expressing itself in actuality. Once we get these irreligious times of the megalopolitan world city, that's when decline sets in. And then he says further, we cannot help it if we are born as men of the early winter of full civilization, instead of on the golden summit of a ripe culture, in a Phidias or a Mozart time. Everything depends on our seeing our own position, our destiny, clearly, on our realizing that though we may lie to ourselves about it, we cannot evade it. Optimism is cowardice. That's a later quote of his in Man in Technics, I believe. But this is of the same vein. It's not our place to be in an age of great artistic striving, a great age of I don't even think Sturm und Drang. That's already kind of the closing of the artistic phase when you have guys like Goethe and young Werther. It's just a great quote. We are in the early winter of full civilization. We must accept that fact. Now, again, there's always a flip side to the coin with these things. And is that just going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Kind of like with the Nazis, if you believe you've got to go to war, and you believe that all that matters is the will to power, and we need a triumph of the will, and all that matters is our technical ability, but we still want to have kind of some artistic, development as much as art is left to us. So, from a Spenglerian critique of the Nazis, maybe you can say, well, guys like Hitler and those guys, they were still trying to be too artistic. They still didn't accept the full nature of our age in just being a completely technical and finance-driven age. So again, so maybe there's a flip side of the coin, and then you got to flip it over one more time. I don't know, but on to the next point. So systematic philosophy for the Western soul closes with Kant. And this is followed by specifically megalopolitan philosophy that is practical, irreligious, and social ethical. And now he begins some of his criticism of Schopenhauer. So he says about Schopenhauer, the will to life creative life force is the center of gravity of his thought. And he says, but this is obscured by his maintaining obsolete distinctions. Refer back to my discussion of thing become versus thing becoming. Obsolete distinctions? I don't know. But he criticizes Schopenhauer for observing obsolete distinctions, like phenomena versus things in themselves. And I also wanted to compare this to Nietzsche here, because I recently read The Birth of Tragedy, because I'm reading this, and, people think that The Birth of Tragedy and Goethe's Morphology of Plants are the two most important works outside of the four corners of Decline of the West for understanding it. And in Nietzsche, about 15 years after he wrote The Birth of Tragedy, which was his first kind of long book-length essay, about 15 years later, he writes this kind of 10-page-ish introduction. I believe it's called like an effort at self-criticism, if I remember correctly. And in it, Nietzsche discusses that he shouldn't have followed Schopenhauer's terminology as much, which I thought was very interesting. And maybe Spengler, to his credit, does try to create his own edifice of this patois, this specialized terminology for his project in a way that Nietzsche and Schopenhauer didn't. So who knows? Who knows? And now, I really thought this was interesting. I think he's totally right with this next point in saying the Hegelian Marx and the Malthusian Darwin. Certainly the Hegelian Marx. There's no doubt about that. The Malthusian Darwin. So I guess Thomas Malthus's ideas about kind of the inherent limits on any biological population. Thomas Malthus himself had a very constrained vision, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out. And then the Malthusian view got co-opted by a bunch of people with the unconstrained vision, as Sowell would say. And now we essentially live in a neo-Malthusian death cult today. The whole global warming crowd is a neo-Malthusian death cult. And I encourage each and every one of them to kill themselves for the benefit of the planet. But I haven't seen so much sincerity from their actions. But to the extent you are not in a neo-Malthusian death cult, and you're not trying to destroy yourself and the planet, I support you. Anyway, he says the Hegelian Marx is led to an economic and the Malthusian Darwin to a biological hypothesis, which together have subtly transformed the world outlook of the Western megalopolis. And it's tough to argue with that. Obviously Marxism and Darwinism, which he views these both as kind of flip sides of the coin, or probably not. That's not the best metaphor. He views them as two facets of Western nihilism, of this historic skepsis, which he's going to discuss very shortly. So, I completely agree with his view of a Hegelian Marx. Certainly, there is a little bit of Malthusian Darwin. I don't know. Maybe it is always reductive to call these guys by an adjective of another guy's name. But I don't know. That's his view. I certainly view Darwin a lot more positively than I view Karl Marx. I can tell you that much. But I just thought it was interesting, and certainly he is correct about how much both Marxism and Darwinism have influenced the modern megalopolitan mind. On to the next and final point. So systematic philosophy, Kant, and ethical philosophy, Schopenhauer, these have already been wound up. But there's a third possibility, corresponding to classical skepticism. And this remains, let me see. Sorry, can't read my notes. But this third possibility, corresponding to the classical skepticism, still remains to the soul world of the present-day West. The soul world, very German, very German. The Geistwelt, the soul world of the present-day West. And it can be brought to light by the hitherto unknown methods of historical morphology, Spengler's approach. And so he says, the classical skepticism is ahistoric. It doubts by denying outright. But that of the West, if it is an inward necessity, a symbol of the autumn of our spirituality, is obliged to be historical through and through, because ours is a historical soul as opposed to the ahistoric soul of the classical. And its solutions are got by treating everything as relative, as a historical phenomenon, and its procedure is psychological. Spengler's approach of trying to understand all these other cultures on a psychological level. Whereas the skeptic philosophy arose within Hellenism as the negation of philosophy, declaring philosophy to be purposeless, so the Cynics, the Stoics, the Epicureans. We, on the contrary, regard the history of philosophy as, in the last resort, philosophy's gravest theme. This is skepsis in the true sense, for whereas the Greek is led to renounce absolute standpoints by contempt for the intellectual past, we are led to do so by comprehension of the past as an organism. So here, perhaps he's speaking imprecisely, because I do not believe that Spengler actually thinks the past is an organism. He views each of the high cultures as an organism. So even now in this civilization phase, even though it might be a dying organism, he views each of these 8 or 9 high cultures that he posits to have ever existed as its own past organism, as its own organism, So I don't think the past is a singular organism. So here, is it just another example of Spenglerian rhetoric kind of getting in the way of clarity? I think that very well could be the case. So he says, in this work it will be our task to sketch out this unphilosophical philosophy, the last that West Europe will know. Skepticism is the expression of a pure civilization, and it dissipates the world picture of the culture that has gone before. So he's recapitulating a theme from some of the earlier parts of the introduction. For us, its success will lie in resolving all the older problems into one, the genetic. The genetic. So, very interesting. Is this reductive? Is it an oversimplification? Maybe. But every paradigm must simplify. This is the use of a paradigm. If a paradigm doesn't simplify, it's of no analytical value. Because a paradigm that doesn't simplify, that's just an ad hoc approach, looking at the world and trying to intuit what we can. We have to simplify with any paradigm. So the only way we can criticize Spengler here is if we think he oversimplifies, or does he posit too many postulates, things of that nature. Anyway, so he thinks all these can be resolved into the genetic, again, because he views each culture as its own organism, and each is having its own life cycle. So we can predict a lot about how the West life cycle will proceed based on, the quote-unquote genetic history of these other high cultures. Now, again, genetics presumes a common ancestor, whereas Spengler really views each one of these high cultures as self-contained. Now, you can say maybe the pre-existing kind of archetypal human thought before any high cultures, the prehistoric man, maybe he is the common ancestor for all of them, but given the importance he places on the prime symbol of each culture and its unity in expressing this prime symbol, I'm not sure there really is a genealogical connection, even viewing things on his own terms. So I think we've got a bit of a contradiction there. But anyway, very, very interesting thoughts here. And so the ahistoric skepsis of the classical, just to reiterate, is renouncing absolute standpoints just based on their contempt for their own intellectual past. The Platonic, the Aristotelian past, that the Stoics and the Epicureans, in this view, the Cynics, obviously, the Pyrrhonians, who I'm surprised he doesn't mention Pyrrho more, and I've mentioned that in earlier sections. Their skepticism is more self-contained and ahistoric. Our rejection of absolute standpoints, our historicism, our doctrinaire relativism, and it does not include me, but that's based on this organismic life cycle view of the high cultures. And now I'll end by just saying that he says this morphology of world history becomes inevitably a universal symbolism. Now, what exactly that means, I do not purport to know, but I think it sounds nice. And then the final paragraph is him just talking his book again. It's nothing special. We've encountered all this again. But the morphology of world history becomes inevitably a universal symbolism. Universal symbolism. So I think what he means here is that once we've analogically compared all these 8 or 9 high cultures, and it's really 8 that he can compare because he views the 9th one as the Mesoamerican culture, which he sometimes calls the Mexican culture. I don't think he ever calls it the Mesoamerican, but that would be a more proper term for it in modern terminology. And there's just no evidence left to us from this high culture because of Spanish colonization and everything. Extermination, genocide, perhaps we could say. And now maybe you take the Jared Diamond guns, germs, and steel view, and you say, well, it was largely these Eurasian pathogens like smallpox. So it could be. It very well could be. More than any planned genocide. But there's really a cultural genocide, though, that goes on because they actively do try to destroy Aztec, Mayan, Incan artifacts. So who knows? But this universal symbolism, getting back to the point, is, in my view, he compares the 8 cultures where he has evidence, and through that he tries to find what any event within those cultures means as a symbol of where it is in its life cycle. That's my view. The more I review this work, is the symbolic importance is really determined by how well this piece of evidence can indicate where we are at the life cycle of that culture. So I don't know. I don't know if that's ultimately the truth. It's certainly a very thought-provoking idea. So join me next time as we further discuss this morphology of world history and this universal symbolism in the final section of the introduction, The End of the Beginning, Part 16 of Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. I hope you've enjoyed my summary and commentary of Part 15. I've certainly enjoyed reciting it to you, and I do apologize about the length to the extent that it is unwelcome. I thank you so very much for your time. Have yourself a wonderful day. Best wishes.